plastics.
An interesting feature of my relationship with my younger brother is that though the Venn diagram of our interests overlaps almost completely, there's always been one little sliver on his side of the diagram that I have vanishingly little interest in, and that is space exploration. Where he's interested enough that he's motivated to stream rocket launches and closely follow news about various exploration efforts, I could not be less interested in that kind of stuff. It just does absolutely nothing for me. In our attempts to figure out the disconnect, my brother has spoken about the vastness of our universe and the infinity of knowledge to acquire and things waiting to be discovered. He says he's excited knowing there's essentially an infinite amount of undiscovered mystery out there. And though he used to feel sad about our having demystified much of our home planet, he found inspiration in the fact that there's no limit to what's yet to be explored beyond it. While I can certainly understand that argument, it's never had the same effect on me. I can remember one of the first times the topic came up between the two of us. We were talking about the various efforts in the news at the time to establish a human settlement on Mars through a process called terraforming, which is essentially hitting the reset switch on an environment and remaking it into one that's habitable by humans. At some point in the conversation, perhaps in the middle of a rundown of the steps involved in creating a suitable atmosphere or overcoming gravitational differences or removing toxic substances from the terrain, I remember feeling what Bo Burnham might have called that funny feeling. The familiar pang of anxiety I'm now realizing seems to lie at the root of almost all of these plastics episodes. If we zoom out over the Mars colonization project, far enough to leave the minutiae behind, if we zoom out and see that what it all amounts to is an effort to take a place that isn't made for us, which is actively hostile to us, in which we're confined to a limited, artificial portion designed to resemble a place we could survive and perhaps not be miserable in. From that zoomed out perspective, it's hard not to see the resemblance to a terrarium. A network of hamster tubes, an artificial place, with hard boundaries around the edges, carved out of reality, and with, in the words of Mitch Hedberg, a stick and a leaf to recreate what we're used to. My beef with life beyond Earth is that this is fundamentally what it looks like. It is our willing election to pluck ourselves from our home and place ourselves in confinement, in the very same way that we'd pluck a hamster or a snake from its natural home and put it in a glass box so it can survive. It's obvious that a caged animal, whether at a zoo or in the suburban bedroom of a 14-year-old boy, lives an unfulfilled life, detached from its environment and subject to constraints beyond its control. And yet somehow, the fact that we as a species have conquered our planet and are free to move about it as we please, eating what we please, doing what we please, living as we please, that fact has given us a sense that we are unlike the other Earth species that cannot venture far outside their strict and predetermined ecological niches. That we alone are independent creatures. We have this idea that we are self-contained machines with inputs and outputs that have vanishingly little dependence on our natural environment, thanks to our ability to substitute the things it provides us with clever, man-made alternatives. But though we are undoubtedly capable of doing that in individual cases, like, for example, when we put oxygen in a tank and go scuba diving with it, what many seem not to understand is just how impossibly far we are from separating ourselves entirely from Earth's environment and the harmony we have with it, which was achieved over the course of many millions of years of coevolution, and that any attempt to do so can't possibly lead to anything other than us ending up in a glorified terrarium. Such a terrarium may well end up being a place where human survival is some kind of possible, yes, but to think that we could create a brand new environment of sufficient sophistication to replicate the infinite number of both known and unknown stimuli that allow humans to thrive, I wouldn't even call that unlikely. It's straight up impossible. This sort of hubris can, at least in part, be explained by an analytical blindness stemming from an aversion to being objective about our own species the way we are about others. No one has any trouble, for example, surmising that the reason polar bears are white is because they're adapted to live in an Arctic climate, and that they'd be ill-adapted to living anywhere else. And yet, when it comes to our own species, we seem to never have considered the fact that variations in our skin pigmentation are due to adaptation to the amount of sunlight available to make vitamin D from at various latitudes around the world, and that consequently, living at dramatically different latitudes from the ones our genes evolved for could lead to health problems like cancer if the latitude's too far south, or vitamin D deficiency if the latitude's too high. Of course, we quote-unquote know about these problems in discrete terms. We know skin cancer exists, and we invented sunscreen to protect from it. We know that vitamin D deficiency is a problem, and we invented supplements to give to the vast swaths of the population that are deficient. But it seems our intellectual curiosity stops there. Any doctor will tell you about your vitamin D deficiency, but never in my life have I heard a doctor connect the last couple of dots and explain that such an affliction, and almost certainly a number of currently undiscovered others, is literally expected when living outside the ecological niche our genes are adapted for. To acknowledge that outcomes are tied to anything other than our own choices would draw into question the reductionist problem-solution mapping that underlies all of modern medicine. We could, without a doubt, facilitate better health outcomes by accounting for these environmental dependencies out of the gate. If a polar bear ended up in Mexico, there would be absolutely zero mystery as to why this one particular bear seemed to be constantly overheated while all the other bears were perfectly healthy. And if we could speak to that polar bear, we wouldn't simply shrug our shoulders and say, "You might consider shaving your coat and buying an air conditioner." What we'd say is, "You're living outside the place you're adapted to. Here are the health problems you're likely to have as a result of it." And yet, when it comes to our own species, we avoid these conclusions at all costs. Why is it that I grew up accepting that sunscreen, a product that hasn't even existed for 100 years, was a requirement for being outside? But it never occurred to me that there was a spot on the globe where I would not only not have to wear sunscreen, but where the local conditions would be fine-tuned to my needs, such that instead of fighting against them, I would benefit from merely existing amongst them. Why do we never use the word habitat to describe the places we live? Answer: because to do so forces us to accept an uncomfortable truth, that we aren't the masters of nature we believe ourselves to be, that we are inseparable from our environment, that we do not have and never will have complete control, and specifically as it relates to space travel, because it invalidates the idea that we could ever truly live, and not just not die for some acceptable period of time, but actually meaningfully live away from Earth. This is the essence of my complete disinterest in life beyond Earth. Yes, there's infinite possibility in space, but there's no way to experience it without either circumventing the very things that make us human, engineering ourselves to alter the biological constraints that keep us tied to this world, or, in the service of humanity's collective curiosity, sacrificing our individual right to life in the only place that can truly offer us one. For the record, I'm not just talking about our discrete physical requirements like vitamin D, but also about the massive psychological impact of living in a human-designed terrarium. There's a reason that movies like The Truman Show and The Matrix resonate so powerfully in our culture. There's a reason that we use phrases like rat in a cage to describe the sheer horror of living a bounded, artificial life according to someone else's design. There's a reason that as humans, we are repulsed by the idea that our world might not be the quote-unquote real one, but an artificial one with artificial limits and artificially limited possibilities, from which we would need to escape in order to truly be free. Life beyond Earth is fundamentally life outside the real world. It is life with edges, both physically in the form of the literal dome or whatever that ends up being that separates the artificial life support world, which by the way would almost certainly take on the form of the highway rest stops I mentioned in episode 3, from the certain doom outside of it, and also intellectually in the sense that everything that happens in this world, everywhere you can go and everything you can do, will be subject to human design and control. And though such systems certainly exist here on Earth as well, there's a key difference here: escape. It's only here that when the engine of humanity becomes intolerable, we have the option of simply leaving human design behind altogether, of absconding to default, to a place where the systems that sustain life are not complicated and brittle, but permanent, complex, and resilient. And where control over those systems is not in the hands of some other intelligent being playing the puppet master, but simply complexity, that great stabilizing force that is everything and nothing all at the same time. When the power goes out in your high-rise office building and the lights turn off, and it becomes pitch black in the windowless interior corridor, and the HVAC system shuts down and the air starts to heat up in the summer sun, and the pump that brings water to the upper floors stops working, and the elevator that brings people to and from those floors stops running, you can simply leave. You can walk outside, and when you do, you're not worrying about whether the light from the sun will come back when you do, or if there will be air to breathe, or if the temperature will be something survivable, or whether the river will have water in it. No one questions whether the concentration of oxygen in the air will be sufficient for us to breathe on any given day. There aren't machines running to make sure the atmospheric oxygen concentration stays at exactly 21%, and yet it does, by default. And, at least outside of the scope of the climate change conversation, there's about as close as you can get to a zero chance of that changing on any human timeline. The sun isn't just going to randomly break and turn off. The Hudson River isn't going to stop flowing. And that's because these are complex processes. They are, unlike nearly everything that humans create, stable. And though there are obviously complex processes that exist beyond Earth as well, it's only here that we are intimately part of them. That makes them our absolute, our default, the thing we can always escape to when the human project isn't quite cutting it. Where everything we do is novelty, what surrounds those things, everything else, is what's real. And we as humans have hardwired into us a need to live close to that real, even if we're not always living within it. And though I don't doubt there are many who would say that they're not affected by such a need, that they could happily spend their days in an entirely man-made environment without ever needing to leave it, I'm not convinced that nearly all of those people wouldn't have a sudden change of heart if the option to leave were taken away. The familiar story appears over and over again in the cultural back catalog. Neo gives up his life of comfort in the Matrix for a life of suffering outside of it, because the life of suffering is real. Truman has to escape his show for the real world. And of course, in recent years, many of us seem to have a powerful aversion to the possibility that we're living in a simulation. Why? Because it means that whatever this is, isn't real. It means that we're living in a designed world, that we're not the masters of our own destinies, that we're not the ultimate decision makers in our own lives, that our behavior and our choices are predetermined by some higher authority. And it's under these sorts of conditions that our ability to imbue our lives with meaning falls apart. Meaning requires freedom. If we're not free, then our choices are really just downstream effects of the choices that were made by someone else. The lives of laboratory rats or the animals raised on industrial farms would be difficult to call meaningful because their behavior and their choices are not made freely. They're made in the context of a framework designed to limit the range of possible outcomes. Yes, a cow exiting a trailer into an open pasture is free to walk left or walk right, or graze or nap, or walk or run, but the pasture is fenced, and the farmer's in control of the fence. The cow has the options it has because the farmer chose to make them available. There are no decisions, with the exception of one, escape, that the cow can make which are independent of the influence of the farmer. Though it has control over its physical behavior in any given moment, it was the farmer who selected the field, perhaps because he wanted the cow to eat the grass there for its specific nutritional value, and for the consequent benefit of being able to add a specific piece of effective marketing to the box the milk ends up in. This cow is not free, and its decisions lack meaning. They become statistics. You can't have meaning without freedom because meaning requires the absence of third-party control. And consequently, humans cannot have meaning without Earth, because Earth is the only place where we can survive in the absence of such third-party control. Mars, no matter how sophisticated our terraforming, can never offer us this type of freedom. It may well have its own complex ecosystems, but they're not ones that include us. And so living on Mars can never be anything more than living within a human-designed system, an artificial world in which we are fundamentally unfree. And you know what? That would all be fine. If people want to go be miserable on Mars, why not let them? I have little doubt that once the novelty wears off, the techno-utopians will be in for a rude awakening when they're forced to confront the misery that is life away from Earth, and to admit, if not publicly, then at least to themselves, that perhaps it's not as utopian a vision as they thought. But the problem, and the reason I've chosen to dedicate time to speaking on this, is that this way of thinking, the belief that it's possible to live a satisfying life outside the real world, isn't just practiced in space. It's increasingly wreaking havoc here on Earth. The town my parents live in recently upgraded one of its main roads to include a sidewalk, and instead of pouring concrete in a straight line like all sidewalks, they decided to lay a path that twists and turns arbitrarily around trees that were not already there, but were planted for the express purpose of giving the path something to bend around. The idea was that, as they called it, meandering path would be prettier and more visually interesting than a straight one. And they could be forgiven for thinking that, since paths that follow the contours of a scenic topography often are some of the world's most beautiful. But they didn't realize that what they were doing wasn't adding a path to a beautiful landscape, but rather terraforming a landscape on which to add the path. The way the path twists and turns had nothing to do with its environment, because there was nothing for it to twist and turn around. The twisting and turning had to be post-rationalized via the addition of obstacles like trees and planters that give the illusion of necessity. And so the entire development, not just the path, but every square inch of the landscape on which it lies, was one big design project. This is the modern way. It's the way we build homes, businesses, infrastructure, entire neighborhoods, cities. We no longer figure out how to embed ourselves in what's real. Instead, we delete it. We erase what's real for the convenience of being able to start entirely from scratch. You can see the impact of this ideological transformation just by looking at a map of almost any city more than 100 years old. In New York City, for example, the oldest part of the street network in the lower part of Manhattan is complex, with the areas of development having been designed to accommodate local geography: hills, streams, swamps, marshes, as well as other settlements, neighborhoods that, in accommodating their own hyperlocal constraints, did not make exactly the same choices or follow the same patterns that the others did, and therefore did not expand to meet each other at perfectly right angles or with perfect architectural consistency. The result is a complex web-like pattern embedded within a complex natural environment. But then something interesting happens. When you cross Houston Street, the complex street network is replaced with a grid. 10 perfectly straight avenues intersecting 100 or so cross streets at perfect right angles. The natural environment of Manhattan didn't suddenly just change at this point. The geographic features that once created complex, fractal urban geometry didn't just disappear. What changed was that, with newfound access to a practically unlimited amount of energy, we decided to stop being one with those features and to instead erase them, in the name of systemic efficiency and control. The small hills that once prompted us to adjust our buildings were instead flattened to accommodate bulk development at scale. The streams and brooks that once flowed throughout Manhattan were forced into underground tunnels that still exist today. And we freed ourselves from the need to design in context. We could now outsource designs to companies around the world that worked under the assumption that they'd be starting from a blank slate, meaning they did not have to even be located near or know anything about the place they were having an impact on. And as our access to energy has increased, this great nullification of natural environment has sped up and spread around the world. Most people are surprised to learn that Mexico City was once an island. It was literally in the middle of a huge lake before that lake was drained to claim land for development. And that development simply does not stop. Bit by bit, we slice off bits of the real world and place them inside the terrarium. And once they're inside, they're gone forever, lost to the ever-expanding nullity. Now, renaturalizing pieces of the terrarium is possible. I've seen my share of renderings of ideas for what to do with the infamous Los Angeles River, for example, which was fully encased in concrete by the Army Corps of Engineers in the early days of the city's history. Some of them are by no means unpleasant, but no matter how awesome the renderings are, they can never take the river out of the terrarium and make it something real again. Ideas like rewilding have gained traction in recent years and are certainly worth pursuing, but the fact remains that any effort to recreate the real will necessarily be a fundamentally human effort, a mere solution to a design problem. It will be a certain way, not of its own accord, but because someone decided that it should be that way. And so long as that's true, it will have no inherent right to exist. It will always have to defend itself from the type of scrutiny that asks, was it done right? Are we happy with it? Can it be improved? Should it be redone? In the real world, there are no mistakes. Nothing in the real world needs to be justified. A mountain does not need to justify its right to exist. It is simply justified in and of itself. No one would ever argue that a mountain was a mistake that needed to be removed simply because it exists in an inconvenient location. And when a narrow mountain road bends along the contours of its cliffs, though it's certainly dangerous and impractical, it's not considered a mistake. But it's precisely the opposite within the terrarium. There, everything has been touched by a human, and so, like a baby bird whose contact with a human means that it can never go back to its mother, nothing in the terrarium can shed the taint of human contact and regain the self-justifying properties of real things. Therefore, nothing in the terrarium is permanent. Lifespans are limited to the time it takes for someone to compellingly reason against those things. This is Terrarium World. It's what we get when our relentless pursuit of control at scale consumes everything in sight and leaves us with a fully designed world, a Martian space station at the scale of Earth, with nothing in it but the things we ourselves created, and nothing outside it to escape to. We aren't quite there yet, but such a completely enclosed world is not as far off as it might sound, especially if our insatiable appetite for novelty and growth continues unchecked. And ironically, there's an argument to be made that the appetite is itself a result of the dissatisfying experience of life within the terrarium, meaning the more we put inside of it, the more motivated we are to expand it. The obvious solution then would simply be to slow down and to revert to an older, more sustainable mode of engagement that privileges context over scale. But what seems to be much more common are attempts to address the symptoms of Terrarium World by adding even more systems of control, the very same types of systems that caused the damage in the first place. It's not just that silly meandering sidewalk in my parents' neighborhood. Everything meanders now, and silliness seems to have become a coping mechanism of sorts. In Montreal, where I live, the city is increasingly full of whimsical novelties. We have bike lanes where the painted lines spontaneously twist back on themselves to form a knot, so that we might have a laugh as we attempt to follow its impossible contours. And there are colorful cycle roundabouts that serve no purpose other than novelty. Our public spaces are increasingly armed with things to do, signboards and games and novelty installations that all seem to amount to an unspoken admission that there is something missing from our places, that simply being there is no longer enough. Yet these all amount to little more than a momentary distraction. The cycle detour might produce a laugh the first run through, but the novelty quickly fades. And in all my years living here, I've never once seen someone actually use it. The whimsy appearing in our cities ultimately cannot make up for Terrarium World's inability to provide for us. Though it presents as a solution, it's actually yet another manifestation of the problem. We don't need a new and improved terrarium. What we're craving is access to the real. I can't claim that anything I could propose here is likely to change this course. It seems likely given the size of the graveyard of compelling but ignored ideas that will just continue to trudge onward to oblivion. But I'd be remiss if I didn't at least share some of the simple changes we could make that I believe would make a powerful difference. Of course, the terrariumization cannot be undone, so much of this problem is beyond the scope of design. But if there's some degree to which design can help, it would be insofar as it's in accordance with design's golden rule, that it's not what you add that makes great design, but what you take away. So long as the real world exists outside the terrarium somewhere, we have the ability to chip away at the walls of our enclosure by relinquishing control in the places it's not absolutely necessary for our survival, and facilitating modes of connection between those places and the remaining real. Practically speaking, I believe that dramatically reducing our reliance on pavement as a substitute for care has the potential for significant impact to this effect, as could narrowing our roads and depaving the vast swaths of unnecessary hardscape that would allow life from surrounding ecosystems to permeate and form tangible connections to human life. I believe that today, when presented with an opportunity to make novel additions or modifications to the environment, choosing to do nothing at all is far more impressive and can have substantially more impact than anything that could be built. I believe that embracing friction, the unhurried, the incomplete, and the imperfect, vaccinates our work against the destructive effects of scale and control. For the scars of those works, giant diesel machines on heaps of dirt behind chain-link fences, are replaced with creations that have no finished form, which grow and die exactly as the plants and animals around them do, and which are beautiful not in that single moment of infinitesimal size sandwiched between the end of creation and the beginning of decay, but continuously in their imperfection. And I believe that such a mindset forces a turn toward the lost, locally adapted vernaculars that once connected us not only to the weather and the climate, but to the enduring forms of culture whose absence may not be collectively understood, but is undeniably felt. Once again, thanks for listening.